All right, so a little housekeeping here. Just there is a simple way to ask questions, and on the sidebar on your left, some of you have already used it, and for those of you who haven't, just become acquainted with it. And we will be answering questions mostly at the end of the show, but we will pick up some questions throughout the webinar. So go ahead and feel free to write questions at any point you're inspired. We've already got our first question already. And see, what else? Oh yeah, we have a new Two Green Energy community. If you go to, the next time you go to twogreenenergy.com, you can click on community on the home page or in the navigation at the top. I welcome you to go in and check it out. There's some polls we'd love to have your opinion on. Uh, just basically let us know your thoughts, and then of course there's a forum with groups, and we'd really love your input on that. There's a slide here that says we have a report from Bill Moore, well-noted personality in electric vehicles. That isn't ready quite yet, but it'll be coming up pretty soon. And Craig's been doing some traveling, which he often mentions on the blog part. And if you want to learn more about how to get Craig into your business, you can just click on the services menu of the Two Green Energy website and learn a little bit more about that.
Thanks for having me on the show. Energy, we're going to have to handle this energy situation. Energy and GDP are tied very closely. We have looming crises in energy followed immediately by food and water, as everybody I'm sure is aware, making electric vehicles 100% necessary to making this transition for the sake of humanity. So, and as I always say to the people who don't believe in global warming, that's fine. Just name there are 6 or 8 different reasons to be concerned about our dependence on oil, and especially foreign oil. Just pick one.
Yeah. In fact, let's go look at a couple of the highlight points too.
Right. So as I say, whether your concern is the $250 billion we're spending annually in increased healthcare costs associated with breathing the aromatics of coal and oil, or you're concerned that we're running out of oil, which we are, at least accessible, inexpensive oil, or your concern is ocean acidification or whatever, you have ample reason to be to get on board with this.
All right, now let's get right into electric vehicles.
Okay. So just briefly, I'm sure nobody really needs much of an introduction on the subject, but so here you've got transportation, the kinetic energy for which is provided from electric energy. So you have one of 5 or 6 different forms of electric motors, AC or DC. You've got batteries, capacitors, and fuel cells, which are different modes of storing this. Mostly you hear about batteries and the issues with respect to lithium carbonate shortages and energy density and so forth. So they're all manner. When I go to one of these shows, I come home swimming in information from PhD level presentations on the 8 zillion flavors of lithium battery chemistries. It's all very interesting, and it's all making progress. As I say in a second, there's no silver bullet on this, but batteries seem to be where it's at with respect to this. The other thing is, there are 230 million cars on the U.S. roads. There are fewer trucks, but they can collectively contribute even more pollution. So we have a huge amount of ground to make up.
And there are some points on the opposite side of electric vehicles.
Yeah, there are people who say that this will never happen simply because, well, for a number of reasons. One is having to do with production. In other words, how many Nissan Leafs can they make next year? Well, it's true that this is going to be slow ramping up. It's also true that the consumer has a vote in this, so nobody knows precisely how this adoption curve is going to go. Drivers, when I created that book, Renewable Energy Facts and Fantasies, I spoke with a sociologist in Texas who go, people demand absolute freedom with respect to driving. I'm not 100% sure he's correct, but it's an interesting, the whole calculus of EV adoption is a very interesting one. People don't want to, consumers are risk averse. They don't want to invest $30,000 in the Betamax of the automotive industry. So There's no doubt in my mind that there are some interesting issues in this. Having said that, as we go to our next slide.
Yeah, let's look at the market potential.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just, I mean, fortunately, I'm not alone in this. I believe, and I attended a seminar last week from a management consulting firm who joined me in suggesting that there's going to be 10% penetration by 2020, and I believe that's perfectly possible. And I argue that the low-hanging fruit, pictured there on the right, is very large. So in other words, there are 25 million households with in the United States with multi-cars that at least one of which travels less than 40 miles a day. So, I mean, that looks to me to be low-hanging fruit. There are natural limits associated with this. In other words, will we have electric, Class 8 trucks or electric aircraft? Well, not in my lifetime. So this provides a large market for other things that are associated with transportation, in other words, synthetic fuels that have nothing to do with EVs.
All right, so let's look at the adoption curve on this.
Well, this is my viewpoint on this. So number one of the things that makes this complicated is that the supply creates the demand and the demand creates the supply. So there is a kind of chicken and the egg thing happening here. There's also what I refer to as the divorce between big oil and big auto. It does strike me that though I'm not privileged to attend the board meetings of either of these companies, I'm not suggesting that I have inside information into what's truly at the heart of the decision-making process on this thing, but it seems to me that Big Auto has said, you know what, we're not going down with the ship on this thing. We are committing to electric transportation. Although there are many challenges of this thing, and especially coming up with an effective value proposition for the consumer.
Let's look at that.
Well, here's what I would say about this. Not everybody agrees with me on this, and as a matter of fact, I haven't found a heck of a lot of people who do agree with me, but I do believe that the dramatic changes in consumer sentiment, like you pictured here with minks, I remember when I was a young man, a little boy actually, and my mother and her friends would wear mink coats when they went out to their dinner parties. In a few short years, you couldn't find a mink coat because the consumer sentiment had turned against us so fiercely and so immediately. So, again at this seminar, there are people saying, well, it's only for people with a certain lifestyle. It's really not for everyone. And I guess you could say that. I mean, there certainly will be technology laggards, but I believe that what is really going to tell this story is, you're pumping gas into your car at $4 or $5 a gallon, and your neighbor pulls up in a Nissan Leaf or whatever it is, a Mitsubishi i-MiEV or the BMW product or the Ford Focus product or the Chevy Volt or whatever, and you're going to go, I want to know more about that, Bob. So my point here is that dramatic and rapid shifts in consumer sentiment are not unprecedented. And I also go to, things like video rentals and CD sales. When was the last time you bought a CD? Well, you can download music immediately onto your iPad or your iPhone or whatever. And so all of a sudden, in a very short period of time, this became, something of a past action here. So the other thing that I like about this thing, that I personally believe, is that there's nothing more patriotic than electric transportation. In other words, than cutting, for all the reasons we mentioned, you want to do something good for our nation, cut the dependence on foreign oil. So here are the reasons. I won't go through them, but I'll tell you what, as a marketing consultant for 30 years to big companies, I'm champing at the bit. I'm just hoping that I get the opportunity to have a client who pays me to tell this story, because I'm going to have a field day with it.
All right, so let's go on to the next one then.
Okay. So there are various bottlenecks associated with this thing, and I think I saw a question come through on this, on this subject. There are numerous forms of bottlenecks associated with grid readiness and so forth. This happened to be in San Diego, where the local utility was saying, we're going to have 400 EVs installed and they're charged 220 volt chargers installed in the month of April. This is going to cause a problem. Customers expect this to be done in 3 to 5 business days, and we're completely unprepared to do this.
You want to take up this question from Brad?
Which one is it?
I hear that EVs will overwhelm the electricity supply and increase need for coal use. Is this true? And then I read some other sources say we can completely go to solar and wind by 2030, and others say they can never be more than 10 to 20%. How do we as consumers sort out the truth?
Well, it's a good question, Brad. A couple of them, and they're obviously two different ones. The first one, there are reports that I find credible that suggest that we could put 90 million EVs on the road this afternoon and not build a single additional coal-fired power plant. Because, in other words, that these things are typically charged with off-peak power, a lot of which is being wasted. And ramping up and down coal-fired power plants is possible, but it's very damaging and expensive to the owners of those plants. They have 40-year lifespans that are cut dramatically when you start doing that. So that's number one. The other thing is that actually even a more interesting question in my estimation, and I'm not an expert in the migration to renewables, except to say that I read the same reports you do, and yes, they are all over the map. Why don't we come back to that at the end, because we have a section on renewables, and I'll talk to that then.
All right, sounds good. Let's move on.
Okay, so the paradigm here is just basically shifting from the old way of looking at this, where the cost to the consumer was heavily weighted in gasoline and maintenance, as you've got a zillion moving parts and exhaust systems and valve jobs and lube and tune and so forth and so on, moving to one of buying the electricity and services. And what do we mean by services? Well, a lot of it that you can see in terms of GPSs, you can obviously have in your current cars, but the telematics, which is the fancy name for services, information-related services that are coming along, include some of the following: green routing, real-time traffic, battery monitoring. Obviously is a very big deal, because for battery electrics, the issue, of course, is range anxiety. But other stuff that you see there, and including vehicle-to-grid information. We'll talk about that in a second.
All right, let's look at the business, or some business aspects of this.
Well, again, to look at, going back to Brad's question, what do you see as the adoption curve on this thing, and defending my position that we'll have 10% penetration by 2020, you have to look at least what people are saying. Obviously you have to look past that at what they're actually doing. But I've heard Carlos Ghosn, who's the CEO of Nissan and Renault, speak at numerous auto conferences, and for my money, he's one of the most credible people in the industry. When he stood in front of a packed house at the LA Auto Show a couple of years ago and said, "We're doing this. This is not public relations. This is not something that we're doing as a smokescreen, or we're doing half-heartedly. We're doing this in a big way. We're making a commitment, and trust me, it's going to happen." And I don't think there's much doubt that Nissan, and certainly the people who are following this, every credible OEM who expects to be here in 10 or 15 years has an EV-related project. Some of them are further along than others, that's for sure. So what does this mean? Well, here's another completely different aspect of this thing in terms of the business strategy, and that is, if you want to sell electric transportation, suppose you have, for instance, I have a friend who has an electric tractor, or aspires to be a manufacturer of electric tractors, and he goes, well, let's sell these things through, garden supply places, the places that you would buy regular, diesel tractors. And I'm urging him to think twice about that, because the truth is that when you look at the incentive to sell one of these things, a lot of the profit associated with this at the dealer level comes from maintenance and parts and service, and this really doesn't exist in any comparable way with electric anything. They have very few moving parts. So you may say, you may get a dealer to say, yeah, sure, I'll try to sell that, and you go show up in a couple of months and it's over in the corner, or it's got a big, tarp wrapped over it. So I'd be a little concerned about that.
Let's move on.
All right. Okay, so on a related aspect, if I were advising people in this space, obviously I wouldn't be advising people to take on Nissan or whatever head on head. If you want a 5-passenger, a sedan with a 100-mile range and a $30,000 MSRP and so forth, well, that's been done. So people who are trying to do that and on a startup basis and compete with the established OEMs, I just really can't imagine that that's going to work. And obviously, we've seen a lot of concern expressed about various companies that are trying to do that. I promised I wouldn't name names, so I guess I won't. But let me go, if I can go that. So niche strategies are a good idea on this thing. So here are three. I see incredible business plans from entrepreneurs all over the space in terms of off-road vehicles, in terms of what you can see there is a little commuter bicycle, a really cool looking thing. So obviously Nissan's probably not going to be building something like that, so to that degree you're protected. And on the current slide, here are other ways of getting involved in this. And there are just, I come away from every conference more impressed with the breadth of ways in which entrepreneurs can take advantage of this migration to electric transportation. One of them obviously has to do with electricity generation itself. So this is overall, it's true that we could put 90 million new electric vehicles on the road this afternoon, but ultimately there are 1 billion passenger cars on the roads in the world, and this is going to be, we do need renewable energy. Somebody asked me the other day, well, is this the renewable energy vehicle of the future? And I go, well, it depends on what you mean. There's no, as Brad suggested in his question, there's no mandate that says that they have to be charged with clean power. So to the degree to which you're using dirty coal, you have a marginal improvement in ecology associated with EVs. And some would say you have none. I don't believe that. I do believe you have a marginal, even with the dirtiest form of coal, you have a marginal improvement.
Well, Craig, related to that, we have a question from Chris Berry, and he's asking, aren't we just trading reliance on oil to power our cars for reliance on coal?
You're right, and that is the exact point we're making here. And the answer is, to the degree to which we have, well, first of all, I hope you heard my thing about off-peak power. So you're going to charge a lot of these things with power that has no value, and a lot of 80% is dumped back to ground anyway. Currently, though we're moving toward energy storage systems, they'll be the subject of another webinar. But these do have the potential to be clean, that's the point. And they have the actuality of being clean as we gradiently clean up our grid mix, as we gradiently increase the penetration of renewables. So PV, wind, geothermal, solar thermal, hydro obviously. So they have the potential to be clean, that's the point there. So just continuing here, I want to talk a little bit about smart grid. So smart grid obviously is the use of information technology in a two-way communication flow between the energy source and the consumer. So the intelligent use of things like charging off-peak, energy efficiency, demand response. So in other words, the electric companies' ability to take certain actions in times of peak demand. And vehicle to grid. So I also attend a vehicle to grid conference every 6 months just to see where this is going. Obviously, it has to do with load balancing and selling power back to the grid at times of peak use. Is this ever going to happen? I believe so, but I think it's a long way down the line and certainly a kind of tangential benefit for us now. Another way to get involved in this thing, obviously, is with the services, telematics. We talked about billing. Let's go to a couple of slides I think I have on billing. A guy did a really nice presentation on this subject, but the net of this 45 minutes later was that it's really up in the air. There's so many aspects of how do I pay for my charge. There's so many different flavors of this thing that it's kind of hard to pin down. A couple of examples you see there, and if you go to the next one, you can see the problems with two major modalities of this thing. In other words, if you want customers to prepay, it's awkward, it's a drag for the customer, and you don't have customer relationship management. So you've got no way to take advantage of the fact that you're building, or you know who these people are, and you're building a relationship with them. If if you bill them after their use, you do have customer relationship management, which is a very good thing, but there's credit risk and there are enormous expenses associated with maintaining those relationships and performing the billing. In either case, a huge issue in this is integration. I personally have experienced when I fly back east and rent a car at, Dulles or something like that, and I get the Easy Pass or Easy Go or whatever it is, the automatic IR-based toll payer. A couple of years ago, that didn't work outside of Northern Virginia. I'd go into Maryland, and all of a sudden, I'd have to throw quarters at the guy again. Now they have that fixed, but I think this is a good example of how tricky this integration issue is. I believe this thing works all up and down the eastern seaboard at this time, but it took years and years to get it to that point. And if you think that was a hassle, wait till you see what's going to happen with billing. In other words, the idea that I'm at a shopping mall or at a friend's house or at work, and I want to be billed correctly, and I want it on one consolidated bill. I don't want bills from 8 or 10 different providers. So this is going to take quite a while to get to.
Yeah, and just as a little note, we have a few questions on the availability of these presentation slides. And yes, for the people who are on the call or on the webinar, there'll be an email going out to let you know when it's ready. It'll probably be a couple of days.
Okay, so here's just a brief, how are we doing time-wise? We're okay, aren't we?
Well, yeah, we're doing okay, but we'd like to leave as much time for questions as possible.
Okay, good. Okay, so another way of getting involved, obviously, is with chargers. There are half a dozen or so big-time charger manufacturers, Coulomb and so forth. Obviously, the charger sits between the grid and the car and does the grid connect, as I say, load balancing, smart charge. So this is a big deal. So time of use charging, time of use metering and smart charging, looking for the positively least expensive times to charge during a 24-hour cycle, given your preferences. In other words, given the fact that you want to have at least a certain state of charge in your car at all times, let's just say, in case your baby gets sick at 3 o'clock in the morning. So you can imagine the level of intelligence that goes into connecting an electric vehicle to the grid and winds up with charging being done exactly as you want. Keep in mind also that you're charging an asset that may be worth $15,000. So this issue of authenticated charging, just simply make sure that you don't wind up with, plugging your car into something that's going to damage that asset. Here's another aspect of this thing. A guy asked me the other day, well, why don't we have more people in the charger business? Well, this is a complex kind of psychological, sociological, and kind of economic issue. But at a high level, I would say this. There are case studies, as a matter of fact, Tokyo, Japan is one of them, where they gave people, they had a pilot program with EVs years ago. And there was one outside of your home, there was one charging point. In the whole city, there was one little block where you could pull up and charge your car. Now, so here's what happened, is that people said, okay, I got a 100-mile range. Most people wouldn't because of range anxiety, they wouldn't let the state of charge go below 50%. So they would recharge when they were down to 50 miles range. Now, all of a sudden, they put a whole bank of these things on the other side of the city. Now people are saying, oh, now I don't have that range anxiety. I'll let it go down to 20 or 15. The problem is they almost never used the new bank of chargers. But the fact that it was there gave them the freedom to do what they wanted. But the poor guy, and of course this is a state-run thing, so and a pilot program, so I would just extrapolate to the owner of those charging stations saying, oh, these people are going to be all over the place with this thing. They're going to be driving near my charging station. They're going to want to charge there. Well, not necessarily. That's the point there. So the issue of the calculus of how do you figure out what is the value and what is the projected use rate of chargers is extremely difficult, especially while we have this early adoption curve going on, and we've got people who are, except for very rare people, these are second cars in multi-car families that have garages into which they can pull and charge. So there you go.
All right, let's talk about the batteries themselves.
Okay. So as I say, everybody says, well, there's this new magic, battery that you can charge in 3 minutes. Well, first of all, the time that it takes to charge a battery is not so much a function of the battery chemistry itself, but a function of how much power that you're delivering to it. So in other words, you're not going to charge, if you're going to put 30 kilowatt hours into a battery in 3 minutes, you need, I can't remember, you need about a megawatt. So if you don't got a megawatt, you're not going to make that happen regardless of the battery chemistry. And by the way, I don't want to be in the same zip code as, something when it's delivering a megawatt to my car. So there are safety issues associated with this too that are being worked out. But my point is that there is no magic bullet in terms of chemistry, in terms of charging. We'll get to charging. There are different approaches to this, and we'll get to them shortly. But let me just say that for my money, I believe, and part of the reason I believe that we were going to have 10% penetration by 2020 and a hockey stick curve upward from there, is simply because as this scales, as we innovate, as there are design standards that come into play, as there's vertical integration along the lines of what BYD in China has 200,000 employees that do everything from, mining to manufacturing of cells, to manufacturing of packs, to manufacturing of cars. Now, I'm not saying that vertical integration is, a solution to a necessary solution to this, but it is an interesting type of thing where you can see that there's an enormous amount of thought going into how are we driving cost out of the supply chain here, and that a $600 per kilowatt hour system is slated to become $300 in less than a decade. So that's going to change the calculus of this thing. When you have a 30 kilowatt hour battery for $8,000 or $9,000, that changes things dramatically.
All right, well, let's look at some other charging solutions.
Sure. So people talk about this all the time. So I'll talk about fast charging first, simply because we were talking about it a second ago. So there's level 3 charging, 480 volts, whole bunch of amps. It isn't a megawatt, but it's half a megawatt or something like that. That is becoming a great deal of work is going into this. Now, so the issue, of course, here is when is this going to get past the early adopters, and when are we going to have full penetration of this? Well, obviously not until we have ubiquitous charging. In other words, you either have fast charging stations all over, in the case of the United States, a landmass of 3.5 million square miles. So you're talking about a significant challenge here. But that's what fast charging is about, obviously. The other solution on this thing is what Shai Agassi, this extremely visible international businessman, is doing with respect to battery swapping and essentially selling charging by the mile. In other words, you drive by the mile. Just like your cell phone plan gives you 1,000 minutes a month, you sign up for a plan that gives you whatever it is, X thousand of miles a month. And whether it's the charge that you get from the charger in your home or battery swapping, in other words, these robotic things that look like gas stations, but it's essentially advanced robotics that pull out a discharged battery and install a recharge battery. So that's a potential solution. Is it a solution for the United States? I don't believe so. He doesn't, he would disagree. He's sold this effectively in Denmark and notably in Israel, where they just, I think it's last week, opened up the first one of these battery swapping stations. It's really cool. And it's a great solution if you're Israel, surrounded by people from whom you don't want to be buying oil, and you've got a little landmass. So there you go.
All right.
So I would suggest that just to round off on this thing on charging, certainly at home and in semi-private locations like the workplace, that's going to account for most of the charging over the next 10 years.
Good.
Okay, so here's what I see. First of all, in the next 4 years, I see this largely about early adopters. Now, people say, well, how many of them are there? Or how many tree huggers can you find and so forth? I don't think it's that. I really do think, I understand that there's a bell curve of technology adoption, and there are laggards and there are pragmatists and so forth and so on. I understand that. But I do believe that the appeal of this, even in the short term, is going to be sufficient to drive the adoption very handsomely over the next 4 years. So I would also suggest that the fact that fleets are doing this thing, FedEx, Verizon, Frito-Lay, I should have mentioned another 8 or 10. There's a great number of the Fortune 500 have extremely aggressive and visible plans that, if they do nothing else, are going to show the world, even the doubters, that these things are for real, that they work, that they don't cause a huge problem with grid integration, they're not horribly expensive. Now, do people want them? Well, I think I have a slide on this, so I don't want to.
All right, well, let's look a little further into the future then.
Okay. All right, so regardless of what happens in this thing, you will get to a point where you've gone beyond the early adopters and you need to speak with what were referred to as pragmatists. But I believe that at that point, you're going to have the real evidence of this hot growth curve. By the way, that's the world's largest hockey stick. Did you know that, George?
I did.
It's in Canada, of all places, if you can believe that.
All right.
Go ahead.
See, we've got some questions coming in, so great. I wanted to encourage that. We will be taking them up pretty soon here. All right, let's move on.
Okay. Okay, so here's what I see. And again, not everybody agrees with me on this, but that's fine. That's what makes horse races. So I believe that for this to happen, you have three things that need to come into place. Obviously, the consumer has a voice in this thing. You need the cars, and you need the grid to build out to the point at which there's understanding of where are these things being bought, where are the chargers installed, what do we need to do to make sure that there's uninterruptible power to these locations, which, by the way, is a non-trivial issue itself. So the San Diego Gas and Electric people say, I would really like to know the identity of everybody who's buying one of these Nissan Leafs, because I want to know where he lives, because I want to be able to make sure that we don't have, if he's going to get 30 to 24 kilowatts every night at 2 o'clock in the morning, it'd be nice to know that in advance. Problem is that there's a privacy issue on this. So they have just recently, and there's states, by the way, that handle this at a state level or at a local level. And I can't remember, I think California is a local level. So at the San Diego municipality level, they've gotten the local car dealers to make this a default. So in other words, unless you say, I don't want my identity given to my utility, unless you specifically opt out of that, the San Diego Gas and Electric learns of the fact that you just bought an electric vehicle, and that's good for everybody. So that's what I believe. So the three aspects of this thing come together. Keep in mind that the issue does Moore's law. In other words, Gordon Moore, the guy who famously pointed out that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles every year or so. And this is proven true for many decades, since the 70s when he said that. So, but does it apply to power systems as opposed to integrated circuits, blah, blah, blah? It's debatable. I believe that, and I'm not saying that there's no technology in enhanced oil recovery or whatever. Obviously, there's technology in the harvesting of fossil fuels, but EVs are essentially pure technology. So I do believe that you're going to see increases in the ability of these things to deliver what's wanted. So in other words, lower costs, better performance, etc. Okay?
Let's look internationally.
All right, well, here are some kind of predictions that I've made that I don't know the specific relevance of each of them, but I hope some of the people listening may find this interesting. So I was at another conference, I'm trying to think of when this was, a month or so ago, where McKinsey & Company, the big consultancy, rated France as number 3 and 4 after the United States, Germany, and China in terms of EV adoption. Personally, I don't buy it. I love what obviously, I don't want to insult the French because, they're fantastic people. They can be a little testy, but I'll tell you what, they make things happen. And what they're doing in France with respect to EVs is just fantastically exciting. Moreover, the fact that they have a smaller footprint, I think is really exciting. They made commitments at all these levels to do this. I find that fantastic.
All right. You want to talk about Toyota?
Sure. Here's another, if I were making a prediction, I would say Toyota is going to find a way to make a surprise announcement on this thing. I do not believe their vision for, I mean, what they did with the Prius 10 years ago was fantastic. They haven't done a lot of it since. The plug-in hybrid that they sell in Japan and in Europe, they're going to announce an American version of sometime in, I think, late 2012. It's a yawn. It's got a battery-only range of about 12 or 13 miles. When I asked them about it, they said, well, that's what they say. When we ask Prius owners what they want, they go, they want a more efficient Prius. Well, I'm not, I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm just saying if you think you're going to sell a car that's got essentially the worst of both worlds, in other words, not only do you have this expensive drivetrain, electric drivetrain, but you've got an internal combustion engine that you got to put gas into and support and maintain and so forth. So it's really not an ideal solution. And if you're telling people you're going to give them a battery-only range, you're going to have to plug in your car and you're going to have to fill it up with gas, it's just, I mean, they've got to be smarter than that. I have to think that at a certain point they're going to go, we got a better idea, here it is.
Okay. Let's look around the world.
All right. Well, here's a couple of other predictions, and I guess this isn't rocket science, but I think everybody sees that the tragedies associated with our traditional ways of generating energy are getting the attention of people who otherwise wouldn't notice. I don't think there are many people who aren't looking independently for a way of getting at renewables. And I know there's some good questions on this. I'll try to field them when they come up. But essentially, people, especially Americans, are realizing that, look, we are about 8 or 10 years away from becoming the second largest economy on Earth behind China. We have no energy policy, much less a federal renewable portfolio standard. We do a terrible job at these meetings like Copenhagen and Cancun in terms of making extremely vague statements that have no teeth in them at all. The fact that we're subsidizing oil and coal, or oil in particular, at 12 times. The oil industry gets $12 in subsidies for everyone given to solar and wind, which I find extraordinary. Here's an industry that's 80 or 90 years old. It's the most profitable thing on the planet, and taxpayers are creating inexpensive oil that is in turn making it uncompetitive to go in the direction of renewables. I just find this unbelievable. And there are a couple more on the next slide here. We pay no attention to the fact that the externalities of fossil fuels are things that actually should be borne by the oil companies. So who's cleaning up this mess? Who's handling the increased cost of health care? Who's dealing with the long-term environmental damage? Well, guess what? It's my grandchildren, and it has nothing. The oil companies are simply deferring those costs to you and me. We also, tell everybody that we're so concerned about the national debt, where we're borrowing $1 billion a day and sending it to foreign sources, most of which are sworn enemies of freedom and democracy. We talk about our concerns about unemployment, but we're going to get 3 jobs. We're going to get 3 green jobs for every one lost in terms of brown jobs, coal mining, etc. And we have no problem with an oil industry that employs 7,000 lobbyists whose job is only to extract favors and to create a playing field that's anything but level in terms of dealing with renewables. So I have a feeling, if you go to the next slide, that people have had it with this. And the 2012 presidential election is going to be a time at which the political posturing, both on the left and on the right, I just can't imagine that people are going to be able to credibly say, I want to be the president of the United States, but I don't have a solution for this. So I don't know. I mean, I think everybody's going to have a position. The cynic in me suggests that most of these are going to be disingenuous, but they're going to do it anyway. And I point out to everybody that we won't have a true democracy as long as this Supreme Court decision that's about a year old now, a little over a year, about the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission is in place. Until we overturn that with a constitutional amendment, we won't have a true democracy. So all of this stuff is simply not happening. And I urge people to check out movetoamend.org.
All right. So we're going to take up some questions now, and we have a number we're going to look at immediately. And if you have some questions you haven't asked yet, then this would be a good time to plug them in on your left sidebar, and we'll get to as many as we can here. You want to take up this one from Greg here. What do you believe is a fair road tax for EVs, and how do you implement it?
Excellent question. I don't have an answer to that, but here the question clearly is the fact that we tax gasoline and use that money to maintain our roads. We do need an analogous solution in the taxation of electric vehicles. I think basically you need a separate metering for electric vehicles, because that taxation is one of several issues associated with the fact that we do need to know who's driving and who's just hogging electricity. So I had a place that unfairly, but I was paying 37 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity simply because I was in the electric hog range. That you bring up a good question. I don't have a good solution to it, but one needs to be in place.
All right, so here's a question from Brad. There was an article today about the government wanting to tax EVs, or tax EV use, since they won't be collecting gas tax. Do they understand that would hurt the EV rollout that they say they want?
Well, this is essentially the same question. In other words, the issue of the tax on EVs. And do they understand that? I don't know. In other words, it is interesting, the fact that there is a federal subsidy of $5,000 and various state subsidies. Most of the states have additional incentives to buy EVs. It does suggest that there is some understanding that we want this to happen, which, by the way, brings the cost of a Nissan Leaf down to almost exactly $20,000. So that's pretty, at least in the state of California, that's pretty attractive. So I don't know. I can't speak to what they're thinking there.
All right, Tom has a question. Do you consider Better Place to be a niche player?
Yes, I do. I consider that it has, this guy, my hat's off to him. Shai Agassi is one of the great businessmen, and I would say even showmen, though that's not a very kind thing to say, but he's an extremely credible and vocal proponent of what he believes in. I just don't think that it's right for every place. He apparently does. He had a meeting not too long ago with the mayor of San Francisco, and they're, I don't know what they're doing up there, but if this is going in that direction, I'll be surprised if Better Place pulls something off in the United States, just simply because the geography of this landmass is so inappropriate to it. But whatever. I'm just Craig Shields. I'm just telling you what I think.
All right. Pratik, I apologize if I brutalized your name, but the question is, can you elaborate more on the telematics business?
Well, only to say that there are a range of information-related services that are associated with this, and we talked about some of them a second ago. So the preconditioning of the interior of your car. In other words, just imagine all the things the apps that you can have on your phone that have something to do with the intelligence of where you drive, where you park, how you charge, how you're billed for your charging. Just the entirety of real-time traffic and all of the things associated with green routing. So in other words, in real time, you can here's the fastest way to get where you're going, but here's the most ecologically safe, and here's, if you're running out of charge, here's the way you ought to do this, because and there are charging stations over here, and the traffic's moving better over here as well. So you can just imagine the dispensation of information to drivers and sharing it with the relevant vendors to those drivers. It's just there's no end to the applications.
All right. Giuseppe's got a question.
All right.
Excuse me. Is this assumption still hold true? EV conversion of existing ICE will be a key in the acceleration of EV adoption.
I don't think so. It's such a good question. It was Andy Grove actually, who, believe it or not, the captain of industry from Intel, who said we need conversions because we got 230 million of these cars, and if we don't have a factory-oriented way of converting them, we're not going to get where we need to go fast enough. Which is an interesting type of a thing. I heard that about 12 or 18 months ago. That's the last I've heard of it. Obviously, I have friends who are gearheads and love to do conversions, and some of them said, "I want to make a business out of this." And I go, "Well, tell me about the business." And they go, "Okay, well, you bring me a used car, just pick it." Actually, you can't just pick it because I can't. There are only certain form factors that are really good for battery placement and so forth. But if you've got, a Ford F-150 truck, as I happen to believe is a good one, bring it in, and for I can't remember what it was, $15,000, I'll convert it. So I'll just yank out the transmission and the engine and the exhaust system, and I'll put in the battery, the motor controller and battery pack. And I go, well, what? So the guy brings you a $10,000 truck and winds up with a $25,000 car. Actually, the economy on this thing was even worse. It was really the guy was going to wind up with a $40,000 used truck, and I go, well, keep in mind that you're going to be selling this against things with brand new cars and trucks with factory warranties that are going to compete in this in price. So I just don't see the issue with the world for conversions. I did, a couple of years ago, I was all over this stuff, especially when I heard Andy Grove speak, but I've been turned off to it since.
All right. So here's another question from Tom Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you sticking to purely electric vehicles then? Why not get chargers out there for plug-in hybrids and electrics? Standardize the charging to 120V and market penetration should increase, right?
Well, there's a number of questions. Don't take that one away. I got to keep my I would say this. First of all, getting chargers out there for hybrids is not as important insofar as if you have, for instance, a Chevy Volt that has a battery-only range of whatever it is, 40 miles, I think. So 78% of Americans commute under 40 miles a day. So for those 70, is it for everybody? No. But is it right for 78% of people? Yes. It's a little on the expensive side because it's a plug hybrid. So you have both the expense of both of these drivetrains. I would say chargers aren't necessary for plug hybrids. I would also say standardizing at 120 volts. The problem with 120 volts and 15 amps, in other words, unplug your toaster or your hairdryer and plug in your car, is that amount of power, whatever that multiplies out to be, requires a great length of time, 10 to 15 hours to give you 30 kilowatt hours. So that's the problem with that. So the standard, there are level 1, 2, and 3 charging. All will have its place. What you're talking about is level 1. In other words, 120 volts, 15 amps. Level 2, 220 volts, is when you buy a Leaf, what you're really buying is not only the Leaf, but a charger that's made by AeroVironment and a contract with a local licensed electrician to come in and install it. So that higher amp, I think it's 60 amps, 220 volts, gives you a good amount of charge in just a couple of hours. And then, of course, we've talked about level 3, 480 volts and a bazillion amps.
All right. Ready for the next one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so here's a question from Ali. How about integrating solar collectors on cars and related? Is there research underway for this now?
It's funny you mention this. I saw a Prius with a solar collector on its roof before I even heard of electric vehicles. And this was fascinating to me. The issue, of course, is with the efficiency of PV, unless you want something the size of a football field strapped to your roof, it really is a non-starter. It gives you enough power to run your radio or something like that, but it obviously improves the range to some small degree, but I don't think it's an important issue. It's kind of cool to look at, though. I'll tell you what, when I saw that, I go, man, that's a neat-looking thing.
All right. Daryl has a question. Do you see similar adoption trends for electric motorcycles?
I'm not an expert in electric motorcycles. I do, my gut tells me no, to be honest with you. A lot of people disagree with me on this, and there are a whole bunch of great-looking electric scooters and bikes and motorcycles out there. Um, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I would just simply say that if you're getting, 70 miles to the gallon anyway, you're going to be less inclined to replace that than if you're getting, you know, 28 miles to the gallon. But that's just me.
All right. Joe's got a question here. Do you support the Pickens plan in H.R. 1380 bill?
Now you'd have to tell me what it is. I'm sorry. Oh, the Pickens. If you're talking about the natural gas and wind and so forth, I don't know much about this. I don't know specifically what the plan is. Sorry.
Okay. Um, got a question here from Green Collar Machines.
Okay.
What's happening in the niche EV spheres? You mentioned tractors. What about forklifts, tugs, and other working vehicles?
Well, I happen to mention that Green Collar Machines is a magnificent organization, and they have an electric truck that they aspire to go into manufacturing on. And the beauty of their approach, as I recall, is that it speaks to this is a tractor that has various attachments, and I think that's the point of the suggestion there is that you can get into a great number of different applications. I didn't put this in the slide on niche applications, but there are container movers. I was down in Long Beach looking at this really cool container mover that's the size of a house, and it's got I think 150 or so kilowatt hours on board, giving it a range of I can't remember 50 or 75 miles, but you can imagine at these ports you have an enormous amount of diesel. The Los Angeles, Long Beach ports are being are under a lot of pressure to cut emissions, and this is a fantastic way of doing that. And that's probably if you want to check out Green Collar Machines, I'm sure you can Google them and see what they're into.
All right. The next question here is, how do you see emerging economies like India figuring into the EV space?
Well, excellent question. First of all, they've got their own manufacturing company, Tata Motors, which is heavily into progressive development in that space. Secondly, they're into wind, especially in a big way. India is doing magnificent things in terms of the penetration of renewables. So exactly what happens on this, I mean, everybody's aware of the fact that there's the population's at 1 billion or so, a lot of which, just like China and Indonesia and so forth, are becoming much more urban. They have a fast-growing middle class that is going to be driving automobiles for the first time, so there's a huge imperative there. And what they do with respect to Tata Motors and the other players in there, I don't know. I'm rooting for them for sure. It's a hugely important thing.
All right. Question here from Star Smith. Is the cost of charging the vehicles very cheap?
Yeah, it's the equivalent. It depends on where you live, but the national average in the United States is 11 cents a kilowatt hour, which puts it at the approximate cost of about 60 cents a gallon of gas. So yes, it's a bargain for sure. And I just filled up my tank yesterday at $4.29 a gallon. So it's a bargain to say the least.
All right, from Dan. Do you know if the new EV charging stations that are being installed will have 110-volt outlets for those of us who ride two-wheel EVs?
I don't. There's a standard associated with this and I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I think they're 220.
All right. Don's got a question. How can EVs be compared to fuel cells?
Well, first of all, a fuel cell vehicle is an electric vehicle. It's kind of an interesting thing. When we say EVs, we commonly mean battery electrics, but we really shouldn't. A fuel cell is obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, just a way in which fuel is converted to electricity. In other words, hydrogen reunites with oxygen, becoming water and releasing energy in the process, but spending that hydrogen. unlike a battery, which stores energy in chemical reactions. So the issue with fuel cells, it seems to me, and I know not everybody agrees with me on this either, but the issue with fuel cells is the problem with fuel dispensation. So in other words, it's the same thing as do you want battery swapping in a 3.5 million square mile landmass, or do you want to spend trillions of dollars dispensing hydrogen all over the United States? It just both of these things seem impractical to me, especially when, as I say, the cost of batteries is falling, and we will get to ubiquitous charging both at level 1 and 2 and ultimately level 3 over a period of decades. But the good point of this thing to me is, so I'm not a fan of fuel cells, and I do believe that this is going to take decades to get to the point where it's important. So in other words, if you want to drive to your grandmother's in Peoria, and you want to take your EV, it's going to be many decades before you can do that without encountering a royal pain in the neck. But I'm not sure how many people want to do that anyway. I've never driven that far. So I just simply believe that the adoption curve on this thing is going to mirror the build out of the grid, and I don't see a lot of bumps in the road. Go ahead.
All right. Juan has a question. Do you think it's a good idea to start investing in infrastructure business now?
Well, it'd be hard to know exactly what you mean, Juan Carlo. Which is probably Juan Carlos. It depends on exactly what you mean in terms of chargers and so forth. As I mentioned, I see a whole bunch of issues associated with the business of installing chargers. There's talk of putting in a corridor of fast charging on the East Coast. So people want to be able to say, okay, I may not be able to go to Peoria, but I can go from, say, Washington, D.C. to Boston, or Washington, D.C. south to Miami, or I can't remember what the conversation's about. So that will happen first. And will there be, how will this roll out? A public-private partnership? Some private enterprise with deep pockets who does something like the toll roads here, there are a few toll roads here in California that are run by private enterprise. I don't know. I mean, personally, I wouldn't be investing my money in this thing because I think there's so much that can happen to change the calculus dramatically.
All right, we're running out of time, but let's see what else we can get in here.
Okay.
Question from Sean. What can we do as entrepreneurs to make the industry see that there is a real need to make the transition to energy efficient building now? Excuse me, and instead of waiting until it is mandated and the cost is acute instead of gradual?
Well, energy efficient buildings is a huge issue. You're probably aware that transportation, in this particular webinar, we've been talking about transportation, which is less than 40% of our energy consumption here in the United States. Most of the remaining 60 plus is building, HVAC, etc. So you're certainly right on that the whole concept of green architecture and demand response and all the issues that have to do with not only energy efficiency but dealing with the utilities in ways that mitigate the need to build more power plants, that, in other words, that to control load so that you don't have brownouts and real heavy-duty demand response issues at times of peak need. So you bring up a good point. And exactly how do you talk to entrepreneurs in a way that they get involved in that, I don't know. But certainly energy efficiency in buildings was here, I remember in the I guess it was the late 70s that people started doing energy audits. So there's certainly a robust business infrastructure built around that. But you're right, it would be good to get more people involved.
All right. Let's see. Sean's asking, what do you think of the electric cars that are ready for public purchase in the year 2011 and 2012?
Do you know the exact delivery schedule on these things? I don't know too much about. I know that a friend of mine, Paul Scott, who's one of the great spokespeople for electric transportation, actually has taken up a job at Santa Monica Nissan and sells the Leaf. And of course, they're delivering, but there are a whole bunch of people waiting for their cars. So in terms of when will we, and another example of this thing is the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, which I test drove at the auto show, I guess, in 2009. They said they were going to do this in the United States in 2010, I think, but they completely changed their mind. The next time I spoke with them, they had completely turned this around. They're selling it in Japan and I think parts of Europe now, but it won't be in the United States for another year or so. So the problem on this thing is, I mean, I would just leave you with this, that every credible OEM has an electric vehicle platform either in the lab or in the production facility. And if you're talking about the Ford Transit Connect or Focus or this Mitsubishi product or the BMW product or what have you, these will all be along at a certain point in the not too distant future. So I keep asking Paul, by the way, I mean, there are leaves and leaves, I guess, on the road. I keep asking him what do you see in the next generation? What do customers complain about? And there is one little thing that he says about the display of how much power or how much range you most likely have left is a little bit fuzzy and inaccurate. And they're going to make an improvement in that. But he goes, every other thing about the car is exactly what I want, and it's exactly what customers want. They love this thing. So there you go.
All right, we're a little over time here. Let's just take up one more question from Joe. As an investor, where and what should be on my list?
Well, that's a good question. That would give me the opportunity to talk about a couple of things. If you go to, if you're interested in the EV space particularly, the report that George mentioned at the onset of the webinar will be downloadable. It's for sale at a great discount. And it'll be up in the next couple of days, and I'm sure it'll be visible. I don't know exactly where it'll be, but I'm sure it'll be visible. If you're talking about sustainability and renewable energy, and to a degree electric transportation more generally, if you go to the website and look at, what is it, investor deals or some deal summaries or something like that, right off the homepage, you will see a dozen or so. It's a little out of date. I need to update this, but you'll see a dozen or so really good business plans, or at least little snippets of business plans, in which for better or for worse, I think I've probably mentioned this, that about a year ago I sent out a newsletter to thousands and thousands of people saying that I would review any business plan for free. And so I've gotten hundreds. I've gotten 600 or 800 of these things so far, most of which are good attempts to get something done, and they have merit. Some of them have no merit at all, which is kind of funny. I read something and I go, you're asking somebody to invest in something that's theoretically impossible or that has no market appeal at all. But most of them have some level of merit. But by my wits, there are a couple of dozen that are eminently fundable and have will ultimately get their funding. Some of them already have, which it doesn't surprise me. So I can see, from a science perspective, from a business perspective, from a marketing perspective, I can see this is going to happen. This is a really good, strong idea that is going to play a role in the ultimate constellation of renewable energy and electric transportation. So somebody's going to do this. So those are available there.
All right. Well, thank you, Craig. You crammed a lot of information here into 1 hour. And we'll do another one in about a month. So thanks, everyone, for being here. And we got to as many questions as we could.
All right. Thanks, George. Good job, man.
All right.